The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, yet inside Thomas Carlyle's tent, he sat comfortably in shirt sleeves while desperate men outside watched their canvas shelters freeze and tear. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The Yukon Territory in the winter of 1867 was a landscape that tested everything a man brought with him. Thomas Carlyle knelt beside a sluice box on Bonanza Creek, breaking ice from the wooden frame with the back of his axe. The water that flowed through the box was barely liquid, hovering just above freezing, even in the middle of the day. His hands ached despite the thick gloves he wore. This was February, the hardest month, when even experienced prospectors questioned why they had come north chasing gold. Thomas was 31 years old and had been working claims in the Yukon for 3 seasons. He understood the rhythm of this life, the brutal simplicity of it. You worked the claim during the brief months when the ground and water allowed it. You survived the winter by whatever means you could manage. You hoped the gold you found was worth the price you paid in comfort, safety, and years off your life. His partner, Henry Davison, was 50 yards upstream, working another section of their claim. They had staked this stretch of creek the previous spring and had found enough color to justify staying through the winter. Not a fortune, but steady production, enough to keep 2 men fed and supplied if they were careful. The camp they had established consisted of 2 canvas tents pitched 30 feet apart on a flat bench above the creek. Standard prospector shelters, each tent barely large enough for a man to lie down in. The canvas was heavy duck cloth, supposedly weatherproof, stretched over a simple frame of poles cut from the surrounding spruce forest. Inside each tent, a man kept his bedroll, his tools, his food supplies, and whatever personal items he had carried into the wilderness. Between the 2 tents they maintained a large fire pit ringed with stones. This fire served multiple purposes. It provided heat for cooking. It offered a place to warm yourself after working in the creek. It gave light during the long darkness of northern winter. And it provided a psychological anchor, a focal point that made the camp feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like something that might sustain life. Thomas straightened from the sluice box and looked upstream toward Henry. His partner was visible as a dark shape against the snow, moving methodically through the same routine they both knew by heart. Break ice, check the box, clear debris, break more ice. The repetition was numbing, but it was how gold was found. Not through dramatic discoveries or lucky strikes, but through persistent, grinding work in conditions that would have seemed impossible to men who lived in warmer places. The sun was already dropping toward the southern horizon, even though it was barely 3 in the afternoon. This far north, winter days were brief. They would have perhaps another hour of working light, then the long darkness would settle over the creek. They would return to camp, build up the fire, eat whatever meal they had prepared, and retreat to their separate tents to sleep through the cold night. Thomas had done this hundreds of times. It was simply how you lived in the Yukon during winter. You accepted the cold, you managed it, you survived it. That was the bargain you made when you came north. He had no way of knowing that tonight would break that pattern forever. Thomas woke to absolute silence. Something about that silence felt wrong. He lay in his bedroll listening, trying to identify what had pulled him from sleep. Then he realized what was missing. He couldn't hear Henry moving in the other tent. On a normal morning, Henry woke first and got the fire going. Thomas would hear him coughing, rustling around, the sound of boots on frozen ground. This morning, nothing. Thomas pulled himself from the bedroll and immediately felt the cold. It was deeper than usual, sharper. His breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air. He reached for his coat and found the canvas stiff, the fabric frozen. That was unusual. Inside the tent, things didn't normally freeze unless the temperature had dropped dramatically during the night. He pushed through the tent flap and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't ordinary Yukon winter cold. This was something else entirely. The air felt thick and dangerous. His lungs burned with each breath. The morning light had a strange quality, pale and harsh. The fire pit was dead, just gray ashes and charred wood. Henry should have been rebuilding it by now. Thomas looked toward Henry's tent. The canvas was covered in a thick layer of frost, completely white. No movement, no sound. Thomas walked toward the tent, his boots crunching on snow that had frozen so hard it felt like walking on stone. Something in his chest tightened. He called Henry's name. No response. He called again, louder. Nothing. He reached the tent and pulled open the flap. Henry was in his bedroll, lying on his side, perfectly still. Thomas knew immediately. He had seen death before. There was a quality to the stillness that couldn't be mistaken for sleep. He stepped inside and touched Henry's shoulder. The body was rigid, frozen solid. Henry's face was pale, his eyes half open, his expression almost peaceful. Thomas stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what had happened. Henry had been fine yesterday. Tired, cold, but fine. They had eaten together, talked about the claim, made plans for the spring. Henry had been alive 12 hours ago. Now he was gone. Thomas examined the tent. Henry's bedroll was thick, his blankets good quality. He had done everything right. He had gone to sleep in a shelter that should have been adequate. But the temperature had dropped during the night, and the canvas tent had offered no real protection. The cold had simply come through the fabric, through the blankets, and taken Henry while he slept. Thomas stepped back outside. He looked at his own tent, identical to Henry's. He looked at the dead fire. He looked at the empty camp. The reality was clear and terrible. He had survived the night by pure chance. The same cold that killed Henry could have killed him just as easily. He stood in the brutal morning cold and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't acceptable. This wasn't just bad luck or the price of frontier life. This was a problem that could be solved. Thomas buried Henry on a hillside overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen so hard he could barely break through with a pickaxe. It took him 2 days to dig a grave deep enough. He wrapped Henry's body in canvas and lowered it into the earth, then piled stones over the site to keep animals away. He said no formal words. Henry hadn't been a religious man, and Thomas didn't know any prayers worth speaking. After the burial, Thomas returned to camp and began examining his own tent with methodical attention. He crawled inside and looked at every element of its construction. The canvas was good quality, heavy and tightly woven. The frame was solid lodgepole pine, well constructed. The design was standard, proven over decades of frontier use. By every conventional measure, this tent should have been adequate shelter. But Henry was dead. Thomas studied the canvas closely. He could see light through the weave. Not much, but enough. The fabric was porous. Air moved through it constantly. In moderate cold, that didn't matter. But when temperatures dropped to extreme levels, that porosity became deadly. The canvas couldn't hold heat. It couldn't stop wind. It was essentially a cloth barrier between you and the elements, nothing more. He examined the corners where the poles met the canvas. Gaps. He looked at the bottom where the tent met the ground. More gaps. He checked the door flap. Even when tied shut, cold air flowed through. The entire structure was riddled with invisible vulnerabilities that only became apparent when conditions turned severe enough. Over the next week, Thomas talked to every prospector within 10 miles of his claim. Most were working the creeks alone or in small partnerships. They were hard men, practical men, survivors by definition. Thomas asked them about close calls with cold, about nights when they thought they might not make it, about friends who had frozen. The stories were remarkably similar. Everyone had experienced at least one night when the cold nearly killed them. Most had known someone who had died exactly like Henry, going to sleep in weather that seemed manageable and simply not waking up. They all accepted it as part of the risk. This was the Yukon. Men died here. That was understood. But Thomas noticed something in these conversations. Nobody was trying to solve the problem. They were enduring it, accepting it, surviving it through toughness and luck. But nobody was asking the fundamental question: how do you build shelter that actually protects you when the temperature drops to levels that kill? He started thinking about buildings he had seen in towns. Real structures with walls and roofs that kept interiors warm even in harsh conditions. Those buildings used thick materials, proper insulation, sealed construction. They didn't just block wind, they trapped heat. They created a genuinely separate environment from the outside. Thomas began sketching designs on scraps of paper. He wasn't an educated man, but he understood basic principles. Heat rises. Cold air sinks. Dense materials hold warmth better than thin materials. Multiple layers work better than single layers. He was beginning to understand what needed to be built. Thomas left for Dawson in mid-March when the weather had moderated enough to make travel feasible. The journey took 4 days by snowshoe, following the frozen creek downstream to where it joined larger waterways that eventually led to the settlement. He carried his rifle, basic supplies, and the small leather pouch that held his winter's gold. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Dawson was barely a town, just a collection of rough buildings clustered around a trading post where prospectors could buy supplies and sell their findings. The buildings were log construction, chinked with moss and mud, roofed with split planks. They were crude but functional. More importantly, they were warm inside. Thomas spent his first evening in Dawson simply sitting in the trading post, studying how the structure was built. The walls were thick logs fitted tightly together. The roof was heavy timber covered with layers of material. Most significantly, there was a proper stove in the corner, a cast-iron box with a metal pipe running up through the roof. The stove radiated heat that filled the entire space. The temperature inside was comfortable, even though outside the air was still well below freezing. Thomas approached the counter where James Kellerman, the trading post owner, was tallying accounts. Kellerman was a stocky man in his 50s who had given up prospecting years earlier to run the store. He knew every man who worked the creeks, knew what they found, knew what they needed. Thomas asked about the stove. Kellerman explained it was manufactured in Seattle, shipped north during summer when river transport was possible. It was designed for sheep herders, men who needed portable heat that could be moved between seasonal camps. The stove broke down into sections for transport, weighed about 40 pounds complete, and cost $18. Thomas asked about stovepipe. Kellerman had sections in stock, black iron, 4 inches diameter, $1 per 3-foot section. Thomas would need at least 4 sections to properly vent a tent-sized shelter. He asked about other hardware, rope, brackets, anything that might be useful for construction. Kellerman showed him what was available. Over the next 2 days, Thomas made his purchases. The stove and 5 sections of pipe, 50 feet of heavy hemp rope, several iron brackets and rings, a roll of canvas for miscellaneous use. He also bought coffee, flour, salt pork, and other staples he would need for the coming months. The total came to $32, more than half his winter's earnings. Kellerman watched the purchases pile up with growing curiosity. Finally, he asked what Thomas was building. Thomas explained about Henry, about the inadequacy of standard canvas tents, about his intention to construct something that would actually protect a man when temperatures dropped to killing levels. Kellerman listened, then shook his head slowly. He said that men had been using canvas tents for 50 years because they worked well enough. Spending a fortune on camping comfort seemed like poor judgment for a man who should be focused on finding gold. Thomas paid for his supplies without argument and began preparing for the return journey. Thomas returned to his claim in late March, carrying the stove and supplies on a makeshift sled he had built in Dawson. The load was heavy and awkward, but he managed the journey in 5 days. When he reached camp, he stored the stove carefully in his tent and began the next phase of his plan. He needed hides. Not just any hides, but large ones, properly prepared, enough to cover a substantial shelter. Canvas wouldn't work. He had determined that through observation and reasoning. Canvas was too thin, too porous, too vulnerable to extreme cold. Animal hides, particularly with the fur left on, would provide genuine insulation. Multiple layers would trap air and create a barrier that could actually hold heat. The hunting began in early April. Thomas tracked caribou through the high country above the creek valleys. Caribou moved in herds, migrating through the territory, following patterns that local hunters understood. Thomas had hunted before, but never with this specific purpose. He needed clean kills that didn't damage the hides. He needed large animals with prime winter coats. Over 6 weeks, he killed 9 caribou. Each kill required careful field dressing. He had to skin the animals immediately before the hide could freeze to the carcass. He fleshed each hide thoroughly, scraping away meat and fat that would rot if left attached. The work was brutal, hours of labor for each animal, his hands raw and aching by evening. The hides then required tanning. Thomas used brain tanning, a method he had learned from a native trapper years earlier. He boiled the caribou brains to create a tanning solution, soaked each hide in the mixture, then worked the hide repeatedly as it dried, softening the material until it became supple leather. The fur remained attached throughout the process. Each hide took 3 days of intensive work to complete properly. By late May, Thomas had 9 finished caribou hides plus 3 elk hides he had acquired through trade with another prospector. 12 large hides total, each approximately 5 feet by 7 feet when laid flat. The pile represented nearly 2 months of constant effort. Other prospectors noticed. Walter Finch, who worked a claim 2 miles downstream, stopped by one afternoon and examined the hides stacked outside Thomas's tent. He asked what the project was. Thomas explained his plan to build a hide-covered shelter with an integrated stove system that could maintain warmth in any temperature. Finch laughed. He said that Thomas had spent his spring hunting and tanning hides like a native while everyone else was working their claims. He said the canvas tent had worked fine for decades and would continue working fine. He said that spending money on stoves and rope and iron hardware was foolishness, when that money should be invested in better mining equipment. Raymond Polk and George Brennan, 2 prospectors who shared a claim nearby, echoed the sentiment when they heard about Thomas's plans. Polk called it Carlyle's Palace. Brennan asked if Thomas planned to install furniture and wallpaper too. The mockery was consistent and pointed. Thomas listened without arguing and continued his work. Thomas began construction in early June when the weather had warmed enough to make outdoor work manageable. He selected a site 50 yards from the creek on elevated ground with clear sight lines in all directions. The location required hauling water uphill, but it provided visibility and drainage advantages that outweighed the inconvenience. He spent 3 days cutting poles. Not random trees, but specific lodgepole pines he had identified during the spring. He wanted poles that were straight, uniform in diameter, and strong enough to support significant weight. Each pole needed to be approximately 16 feet long and 2 to 3 inches thick at the base. He cut 15 poles total, stripped the bark from each one, and let them dry for a week. The framework went up slowly. Thomas lashed the poles together at the apex using braided rawhide, creating a conical structure similar to native designs but engineered with more precise spacing and angle calculations. The poles formed a circle 14 feet in diameter at the base. The structure was taller and broader than a standard canvas tent, large enough to stand upright inside with room for a stove, sleeping platform, and supply storage. Next came the hides. Thomas had studied how to layer them for maximum insulation. He started at the bottom, overlapping each hide with the one above it like shingles on a roof. The fur faced outward where it would shed wind and precipitation. The leather faced inward where it would retain radiant heat from the stove. Each hide was laced to adjacent hides using thin rawhide strips, threaded through holes he had punched along the edges. The layering created a double wall effect. Air trapped between overlapping hides provided insulation. The multiple layers meant wind couldn't penetrate to the interior. The total thickness of the hide covering varied from 4 to 6 inches, depending on how many layers overlapped at any given point. Installing the stovepipe required careful planning. Thomas needed to route the pipe through the apex without creating a fire hazard or allowing heat to escape. He fashioned a metal collar from one of the iron brackets he had purchased, creating a ring that fit snugly around the pipe. He embedded this collar into the hide covering at the peak, sealing it with a mixture of pine pitch and rendered fat. The stovepipe extended 8 feet above the tent peak with a cap to prevent rain and snow from entering. The guy line system was the final critical element. Thomas drove 12 stakes into the ground in a circle around the tent, each stake positioned 15 feet from the tent base and angled toward the structure. He ran rope from each stake to connection points on the hide covering at approximately mid-height. When he tensioned these lines properly, they pulled the hides taut against the pole framework, eliminating gaps and creating a sealed envelope. The door required special attention. Thomas created a vestibule using 2 additional poles that extended from ground level to the door opening at 45-degree angles. This created an airlock entry that would prevent cold air from rushing directly into the heated interior. The construction took 3 weeks from start to finish. By early July, Thomas had completed the structure and moved his supplies inside. The interior was spacious compared to his canvas tent, with enough room to stand comfortably and move around without constantly hitting the walls. He built a simple sleeping platform along one side, raised 2 feet off the ground. He positioned the stove in the center where it could radiate heat evenly in all directions. Summer in the Yukon was brief, and the nights remained cool, even in July. Thomas used these moderate conditions to test his system and identify problems before winter arrived. He fired the stove each evening and monitored how the tent performed. The first issue he discovered was draft control. If he built the fire too hot, smoke backed up into the interior. He learned to adjust the stove's air intake and regulate the burn rate to maintain steady heat without creating excessive smoke. The guy lines required constant adjustment. As the hide settled and stretched, some lines became loose while others grew too tight. Thomas walked around the perimeter each morning, checking tension and making corrections. He developed a feel for how taut each line should be, tight enough to eliminate gaps, but not so tight that it stressed the hide connections. In late August, an unseasonable cold front moved through the region. The temperature dropped to 25 degrees below freezing over the course of one night. Thomas woke to find frost covering the interior of his old canvas tent, which he had left standing nearby. He had been sleeping in the new hide tent and barely noticed the temperature change. The stove had maintained comfortable warmth throughout the night. He stepped outside and examined the structure. The hides showed no frost accumulation. The guy lines held firm. The vestibule poles had prevented wind from blowing directly into the doorway. He touched the exterior hide surface and found it cold but dry. No moisture had condensed and frozen on the outer layer, which meant the insulation was working properly, and interior heat wasn't escaping to create condensation points. Thomas spent the day monitoring firewood consumption. He discovered that the stove used significantly less wood than an open campfire to maintain the same level of warmth. The enclosed combustion was more efficient. The insulated tent walls retained heat instead of letting it dissipate immediately into the outside air. He calculated that he could keep the tent warm through a winter night using about 1/3 the firewood he would have needed for an open fire. Walter Finch stopped by that afternoon and looked at the tent with obvious skepticism. He acknowledged that it appeared warm, but pointed out that 25 below wasn't serious cold. "Wait until it hit 40 or 50 below," he said. Then they would see if Carlyle's palace really worked, or if Thomas had just wasted his entire summer building an elaborate shelter that would fail when it mattered most. Thomas didn't argue. He simply continued refining his system and preparing firewood for winter. Winter came early in 1867. By November, the creeks were frozen solid, and prospecting work had stopped entirely. Men hunkered down in their camps, waiting for spring. The cold was steady and manageable through November and most of December. Temperatures stayed between 0 and 20 below, normal for the Yukon, conditions that experienced prospectors knew how to handle. Then on December 18th, everything changed. Thomas woke before dawn and immediately sensed something different. The air felt dense and still. When he stepped outside briefly to check his firewood supply, the cold hit him with shocking intensity. His breath froze instantly. The moisture in his nostrils crystallized. His exposed skin began to ache within seconds. He retreated inside and built up the stove fire. Through the hide walls, he could hear sounds from other camps. Men coughing, moving around, trying to stay warm. The canvas tents offered minimal protection in this kind of cold. Thomas knew from experience that men would be huddling in their bedrolls, wearing every piece of clothing they owned, maybe sleeping in shifts so they could keep fires going continuously. Inside his tent, the temperature remained comfortable. The stove radiated steady heat. The hide Walls and careful guy line tensioning had eliminated drafts completely. The vestibule entrance prevented cold air from rushing in when he added wood to the fire. Every element he had engineered was functioning exactly as intended. By midday, the temperature had dropped further. Thomas estimated 40 below, possibly colder. This was the kind of cold that killed people. At these temperatures, exposed skin froze in under 5 minutes. Canvas tents became rigid. Fire smoke hung low to the ground. Everything metal became painful to touch, even through gloves. Thomas heard shouting from downstream. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped into the vestibule. Through the gap, he could see movement at one of the nearby camps. 2 men were struggling with a canvas tent that had partially collapsed. The fabric had frozen so stiff it had torn under its own weight. The men were trying to hold the structure up while simultaneously keeping a fire going. It was clearly a losing battle. By evening, the situation had deteriorated further. Thomas could see multiple campfires burning along the creek, much larger than normal. Men were burning enormous amounts of wood, trying to generate enough heat to survive. Some camps appeared abandoned entirely, the occupants having fled downstream toward Dawson rather than risk another night in inadequate shelter. Thomas maintained his fire at a moderate level. The tent stayed warm. He ate a simple meal, comfortable in his shirt sleeves despite the lethal cold outside. The contrast was stark and undeniable. His system worked. The months of planning, the expense, the mockery he had endured, all of it was justified by this moment. Around midnight, he heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside his tent. Then a voice, desperate and shaking. Edward Mackenzie, asking if Thomas was awake, asking if he could please come inside. Thomas opened the vestibule flap and found Edward Mackenzie standing in the darkness, shaking violently. Mackenzie was a prospector who worked a claim about a mile upstream. He was wrapped in blankets over his coat, his face pale, his lips tinged blue. Frost covered his beard and eyebrows. He looked at Thomas with desperate eyes and asked if he could come in, just for a while, just to get warm. Thomas pulled him inside immediately. The contrast between the exterior cold and the tent's interior warmth was so dramatic that Mackenzie gasped when he entered. Thomas guided him to sit near the stove and began removing the frozen outer blankets. Mackenzie's hands were clumsy and unresponsive. Thomas recognized the early stages of frostbite on several fingers. He heated water on the stove and had Mackenzie drink it slowly. He wrapped him in dry blankets and positioned him where the stove's radiant heat could reach him most effectively. For 20 minutes, neither man spoke. Mackenzie simply sat shaking as his body slowly warmed. Color gradually returned to his face. His breathing steadied. Finally, Mackenzie spoke. He said his tent had become uninhabitable. The canvas was frozen solid and had torn in multiple places. His fire pit couldn't generate enough heat to matter. He had been lying in his bedroll for hours, unable to get warm, feeling his body gradually shutting down. He had realized he was going to die if he stayed there. So he had wrapped himself in everything he owned and stumbled through the dark toward Thomas's camp. He said he had mocked Thomas all summer, called his tent Carlyle's Palace, laughed about the waste of time and money. He said he thought Thomas was a fool. Now he understood that Thomas had been the only one thinking clearly. Everyone else had been accepting conditions that could kill them. Thomas had refused to accept that. Mackenzie asked how it worked. Thomas explained the complete system, the hide insulation and how multiple layers trapped air, the guy line tensioning that eliminated drafts by keeping the covering taut and sealed, the vestibule entrance that prevented cold air from rushing directly into the heated space, the stove placement and ventilation that created efficient heat distribution, the elevated sleeping platform that kept you off the frozen ground. He explained that every element people had called excessive or unnecessary was actually essential. Remove the guy line system and drafts would make the tent impossible to heat. Remove the vestibule and you would lose massive amounts of warmth every time you entered or exited. Use canvas instead of hides and you would have no real insulation. Use an open fire instead of a stove and you would burn 3 times the wood for half the warmth. Mackenzie listened carefully. He said that men were going to die tonight in their canvas tents. Some had already abandoned their claims and started toward Dawson. Others were trying to tough it out and might not survive. He asked if Thomas would teach him how to build a tent like this. The extreme cold lasted 3 days. When temperatures finally moderated, 4 prospectors had abandoned their claims permanently, fleeing to Dawson and never returning. 2 men suffered severe frostbite that cost them fingers. Edward Mackenzie survived because Thomas had taken him in that night. By spring, word of what had happened spread through every mining camp in the Yukon Territory. Mackenzie was the first to build a copy of Thomas's design. He spent the summer of 1868 hunting hides and constructing his tent with careful attention to every detail Thomas had shared. Albert Sinclair, who worked a claim on Eldorado Creek, built another version. By the winter of 1869, 11 prospectors in the region had adopted the system. Not everyone. Some still considered it excessive or too expensive. But those who had experienced the 40 below night understood. The design evolved as others added their own modifications. Some men used moose hides instead of caribou. Others experimented with different guy line configurations. A few built larger versions that could house 2 men comfortably. But the core principles remained consistent. Hide insulation, integrated stove with proper ventilation, guy line tensioning for draft elimination, and vestibule entry for heat retention. James Kellerman at the Dawson Trading Post began stocking more stoves and stovepipe sections. Demand increased as more prospectors adopted the design. By 1870, Kellerman estimated that roughly 30% of winter prospectors in the territory were using what he called Carlisle-style tents. The phrase entered common usage. When men talked about shelter, they would say a tent was built like a Carlisle tent, meaning it was engineered for genuine protection rather than just basic coverage. Thomas continued prospecting until 1873. He found modest amounts of gold, enough to live on, but never the fortune that drew most men north. In the spring of 1873, he sold his claim and left the Yukon. He traveled to British Columbia and bought a small farm near the Fraser River. He married in 1875 a widow named Catherine who had 3 children from her first marriage. They had 2 more children together. Thomas lived quietly, farming and raising his family, never speaking much about his years in the goldfields. He died in 1894 at the age of 58 from pneumonia. His funeral was attended by family and neighbors who knew him as a farmer. None of them knew about the tent design that had saved lives in the frozen north. Catherine buried him in a small cemetery outside New Westminster. His gravestone listed his name, his birth and death years, and nothing else. But in the Yukon, prospectors still talked about Carlisle tents. Some of the original structures still stood, maintained and occupied by new generations of miners. The technique had become standard knowledge, passed from experienced men to newcomers. When someone asked how to survive a Yukon winter, the answer always included proper shelter built on principles that Thomas Carlyle had proven one frozen night in 1867.